The first thing I noticed wasn't the shouting, it was the silence. Nearly 40 people stood frozen along the gravel driveway leading to my farmhouse. Sheriff's deputies had stopped traffic. 2 black SUVs idled near the entrance with their engines humming. Red and blue emergency lights bounced off the old white barn my grandfather built almost 70 years earlier. Then I heard her. "This is my community now," the woman screamed, pointing an angry finger toward me. "Arrest him! He's interfering with official HOA business." Her designer heels sank into the muddy ground as she marched forward like she owned every acre in front of her. The deputies exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody moved. She mistook their hesitation for agreement. "You heard me," she barked. "This man has been obstructing our inspection for months. Remove him from my property immediately." My property. Those words almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my weathered field jacket. The movement sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. Several neighbors leaned forward. One deputy instinctively rested a hand near his holster. The HOA president folded her arms with a smug smile. "Finally giving up?" she asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Smart choice. I looked directly into her eyes. "No," I answered calmly. I pulled out a leather credential wallet and flipped it open. The gold badge caught the afternoon sun. My federal identification rested beneath it. The smile disappeared from her face. "I'm Special Agent Ethan Carter," I said, keeping my voice level. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. The woman's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to disbelief. She blinked twice, then laughed. A loud, forced laugh. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Nice costume." One of the black SUVs opened its rear door. 2 men wearing dark suits stepped out. Neither looked at me. They walked straight toward the HOA president. Every step echoed across the quiet farmyard. The woman frowned. "Can I help you?" she demanded. One of the men calmly produced his credentials. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'm Special Agent Daniel Ruiz." He gestured toward his partner. "This is Supervisory Special Agent Rebecca Collins." The woman's face turned ghost white. I don't understand." "You entered federally protected property without authorization," Agent Collins said. "You also ignored multiple written notices instructing your association to cease all unauthorized inspections." She opened a slim folder. "We have recordings of this morning's events." The HOA president looked around desperately, searching the crowd for someone, anyone, to defend her. Nobody did. Her own board members slowly took several steps backward. One actually lowered his head and quietly walked toward his car. She reached into her purse with trembling hands. "My attorney will—" Agent Ruiz interrupted gently. "Ma'am, I wouldn't recommend making any additional statements." Her lips parted. Nothing came out. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked frightened. Not angry, not offended, terrified. The sheriff walked over to me. "I had no idea," he admitted quietly. "That was intentional," I replied. I had spent years keeping my professional life separate from my personal one. Around town, I was simply the quiet farmer who restored tractors, repaired fences, and minded his own business. Almost nobody knew that my farm also served another purpose. The woman suddenly pointed toward my equipment barn. "He's hiding something in there," she shouted desperately. "Search it." Agent Collins slowly closed the folder in her hands. "We already have." The entire crowd turned toward the old red barn. The massive sliding doors began to open. Inside, someone stepped into the sunlight, carrying a sealed evidence case that absolutely should not have existed on an ordinary family farm. And the moment the HOA president saw what was inside, she nearly collapsed. The evidence case didn't appear on my farm by accident. To understand why the HOA president nearly collapsed the moment she saw it, you have to understand who I really was, and why that old farm meant more to me than anyone in Oak Ridge ever realized. My name is Ethan Carter. I was 43 years old, and to most people in Franklin County, Tennessee, I was simply the quiet farmer on Carter Road. Every morning before sunrise, I'd be feeding cattle, checking fences, or repairing equipment that had probably been running since before I was born. I drove an aging Ford pickup with faded paint, wore worn-out work boots, and usually had enough dirt on my jeans to convince anyone I'd never worked behind a desk a day in my life. That was exactly how I wanted it. Very few people knew that farming was only half of my life. The other half belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For nearly 15 years, I'd worked complex financial crimes, public corruption, and organized fraud cases. My assignments often required long periods of anonymity. The Bureau encouraged us to keep low profiles whenever possible, especially when investigations stretched across multiple jurisdictions, so I never advertised what I did. My mailbox simply read, Carter, no titles, no credentials, no flags, nothing that invited attention. The farm had belonged to my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather had purchased the first 60 acres after returning from World War I with little more than determination, and a loan he spent 20 years paying off. Every generation added a little more, 10 acres here, 30 there. By the time my father passed away, the property covered nearly 300 acres of rolling pasture, hardwood timber, and fertile fields that overlooked the Harpeth River. I still remembered walking beside Dad when I was 10. He rested one rough hand on an old split-rail fence and smiled across the valley. "Son," he'd said, "people think owning land means the land belongs to you." He shook his head. "It doesn't." I looked up at him. "You belong to it." Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. When cancer took him 6 years earlier, I almost sold everything. Working 2 careers while maintaining a farm felt impossible. But every time I thought about listing the property, I'd hear his voice, "You belong to it." So I stayed. My neighbors appreciated that. Most of them had known my family for decades. Old Mr. Jenkins across the creek would wave every morning from his tractor. The Harris family occasionally brought over homemade peach cobbler after harvest season. Kids fished in the pond with permission. Hunters asked before crossing fences. Life was peaceful, predictable. Exactly the kind of place where people still trusted handshakes more than contracts. That began to change. The spring construction crews arrived. At first, nobody objected. The county had approved a new upscale development on land that bordered my eastern property line. Construction meant jobs, new businesses, higher property values according to the developers. Huge signs appeared beside the highway, advertising luxury homes, Cedar Ridge Estates, where prestige meets country living. Within months, bulldozers reshaped hillsides that had once been covered in oak trees. Paved roads replaced dirt paths. Streetlights appeared where coyotes used to roam. Then came the gates. Tall stone entrance pillars, decorative fountains, security cameras. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully designed to impress. I figured we'd simply become neighbors. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, while repairing a section of fence near the eastern pasture, I noticed 3 strangers standing just inside my property. None of them had asked permission. A woman wearing sunglasses pointed toward my equipment barn, while speaking with 2 men carrying clipboards. They weren't measuring from the property line. They were walking through my field. I climbed off the tractor and started toward them. "Morning," I called. The 3 turned. The woman smiled politely, but it never reached her eyes. "Oh," she said. "You must be the owner." "I am." She extended a manicured hand. "Linda Ashcroft." Her handshake was firm, almost rehearsed. "I'm the newly elected president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I glanced toward the gated community almost half a mile away. "Congratulations," she smiled again. "We're conducting routine inspections of neighboring properties." I frowned. "Neighboring properties?" "Yes." She looked around my farm as though evaluating merchandise. "We need to ensure adjacent land complies with community appearance standards." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then she reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out several printed pages. "I'm afraid we'll need to discuss a few violations." I stared at the papers, then back at her. "My farm isn't part of your HOA." "I understand why you'd think that," she replied pleasantly. "But our governing documents affect surrounding properties that impact community value." Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not because I believed her, because she did. And standing there in the middle of my family's pasture, watching strangers inspect land they had no right to enter, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The unmistakable instinct that someone wasn't merely mistaken. They were following a plan. I didn't argue with Linda Ashcroft that morning. Not because I believed a word she said, because years with the FBI had taught me that the fastest way to expose someone's intentions was to let them keep talking. I folded my arms and looked at the stack of papers in her hands. "What violations?" I asked evenly. Linda smiled, as if she'd been waiting for the question. "The condition of your equipment barn." She pointed toward the weathered red structure my grandfather had built by hand. "The faded paint lowers the visual appeal of neighboring luxury properties. She flipped another page. The fencing is inconsistent. Another page. The cattle are visible from Cedar Ridge Boulevard. Another. The tractor parked beside your workshop has been in the same location for more than 48 hours. I stared at her. That's because I use it. One of the men with clipboards chuckled before quickly looking away. Linda shot him a sharp glance. The smile vanished from his face. She returned her attention to me. Our Architectural Standards Committee believes these issues negatively affect community aesthetics. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A real laugh. Not mocking, just genuine disbelief. You've got an Architectural Standards Committee evaluating a working cattle farm. This isn't amusing, Mr. Carter. No, I agreed. It's confusing. She narrowed her eyes. I'm trying to resolve this professionally. So am I. I took one slow step closer. But let's start with something simple. I pointed toward the grass beneath her expensive shoes. You're standing on private property. Her chin lifted. We have legal authority to inspect neighboring parcels. No, you don't. We've consulted counsel. I'd ask for a refund. The two clipboard carriers exchanged another nervous glance. Linda's face tightened. You seem unwilling to cooperate. I'm unwilling to pretend your HOA governs land it doesn't own. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The breeze moved through the pasture, rustling the tall grass between us. Finally, she tucked the papers back into her portfolio. This conversation isn't over. I didn't think it was. As she walked away, she stopped beside my mailbox. She glanced at the simple black letters that read Carter. Then she smiled. Not politely this time. Calculating. I'll be seeing you again. She kept her promise. 3 days later, I found bright orange survey flags driven into my hayfield. Not near the property line, nearly 30 feet inside it. I pulled one out, then another, then another. By lunch, I'd removed 27. The next morning, they were back. This time there were 42. I called the county survey office. The woman who answered checked their records. No survey crews have been scheduled on your property, Mr. Carter. None? None. Interesting, very interesting. I drove into town and purchased 4 new trail cameras. By sunset, they were hidden among cedar trees, overlooking the eastern fence line. Years of surveillance work had made concealment second nature. If someone crossed onto my property again, I'd know exactly who. The footage arrived sooner than expected. At 6:18 the following morning, a white luxury SUV stopped beside my eastern gate. Linda stepped out. She wasn't alone. 3 contractors climbed from the vehicle, carrying measuring wheels and stakes. One of them unlocked my gate, unlocked it. I replayed the footage 3 times. He hadn't cut the chain. He'd used a key. Except there was only one key to that lock. Mine. I paused the video, zoomed in. The key wasn't identical. It was a duplicate. Someone had copied it. That bothered me more than the trespassing. I immediately replaced every lock on the property. 2 days later, the confrontation became public. I was repairing an irrigation pump when 3 Franklin County Sheriff's deputies rolled into my driveway. Behind them came Linda's SUV. She climbed out wearing a cream-colored blazer and oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. One deputy approached me. "Morning, Mr. Carter." Deputy. He looked uncomfortable. "We received a complaint." "About?" Linda answered before he could. "He's threatening HOA inspectors." I looked at the deputy. "I've never threatened anyone." She reached into her purse and produced several printed photographs. "He's been removing official survey markers." I almost smiled. "Survey markers placed illegally." She ignored me. "And he installed surveillance cameras to intimidate our volunteers." The deputy rubbed the back of his neck. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" "Go ahead." "Did you remove the stakes?" "Yes." "Were they on your property?" "Yes." Linda immediately interrupted. "That's disputed." "No," I replied calmly. "It isn't." She crossed her arms. "Our survey says otherwise." I looked directly at her. "Then bring your licensed surveyor." "We don't need to." "You absolutely do." The deputy sighed. "This sounds like a civil dispute." Linda's voice rose. "No, deputy. He's interfering with lawful HOA operations." "There are no lawful HOA operations on my land." She stepped closer. "You're becoming hostile. I'm becoming tired." Her expression hardened. "People like you always think the rules don't apply." The words hung in the air. "People like you." I knew exactly what she meant. Not farmers. Not landowners. people who refused to be controlled. The deputy finally raised both hands. "Everyone settle down." I nodded. "I'm settled." Linda wasn't. She pointed toward my barn. "I want access to every structure on this property." "No. You don't have the authority to refuse." "I do. We'll obtain it." "You won't." Her smile slowly returned. The confident one. The one she'd worn during our first meeting. "You'll be surprised what influence our board has." I held her gaze. "I doubt that." She leaned in until we were barely 3 feet apart. "This farm won't stay yours much longer." Then she turned, climbed into her SUV, and drove away. The deputies apologized for the disturbance before leaving. I watched the dust settle behind their vehicles. My phone vibrated. A secure bureau notification appeared on the screen. "Urgent. Contact supervisor immediately," I answered. My supervisor didn't waste time. "Ethan," he said. "What exactly is the name of that HOA president?" "Linda Ashcroft." Silence. Then his voice became deadly serious. "Do not confront her alone again." "Why?" Another pause. "We've seen that name before." And in that instant, I realized this was no longer just a property dispute. Somehow, the woman trying to take my family farm had just crossed paths with an FBI investigation that was far bigger and far more dangerous than either of us had imagined. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried about losing the farm. I had the deeds, the surveys, and more than a century of recorded ownership. Legally, my position was solid. What kept me awake was my supervisor's reaction. In 15 years with the Bureau, I'd heard that tone only a handful of times. It wasn't the voice of someone surprised. It was the voice of someone recognizing a dangerous pattern. At 6:30 the next morning, I drove to the FBI field office in Nashville. Supervisory Special Agent Rebecca Collins was already waiting in a secure conference room. A thick file sat in front of her, but she didn't open it immediately. She motioned toward the chair across from her. "Close the door, Ethan." I did. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "Before we discuss anything classified, I need to know something." "What?" "Have you shared your FBI status with anyone connected to Cedar Ridge?" "No." "Good." She nodded slowly. "Keep it that way." She finally opened the file. The first photograph showed Linda Ashcroft standing at a ribbon-cutting ceremony beside Cedar Ridge's developer, Gregory Holloway. The second showed them together at a charity gala. The third caught them leaving a private meeting at a downtown law office. "This isn't just an HOA," Rebecca said quietly. "It hasn't been for a long time." I leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" She slid another document across the table. "For the past 18 months, we've been investigating allegations involving fraudulent land acquisitions, forged easement agreements, and inflated property valuations tied to several luxury developments across Middle Tennessee." My stomach tightened. "Cedar Ridge? It's one of them. So Linda, maybe more than an HOA president." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "We don't have enough evidence to charge her with anything. Yet." She met my eyes. "Yet." That afternoon, I contacted the one person I trusted outside the Bureau with property matters, Margaret Whitmore. She was 68 years old, a semi-retired real estate attorney, and had spent nearly 4 decades untangling land disputes across Tennessee. Around the courthouse, people joked that Margaret knew the county records better than the clerks who maintained them. She welcomed me into her office with a warm smile. "Ethan Carter." She poured 2 cups of coffee. "The man who only calls when something interesting is happening." I wish this were less interesting. After listening to everything, she folded her hands on the desk. "Let's not assume anything." She stood. "We verify." That was one reason I respected her. No dramatic speeches, no guessing, just facts. The county archives occupied the basement of the old courthouse. Dust floated through beams of sunlight as shelves packed with aging record books stretched in every direction. A records clerk named Thomas greeted Margaret with a grin. "You hunting ghosts again?" "Worse," she replied. "Paperwork." He laughed and disappeared into the storage room. Within minutes, we were surrounded by plat maps, deed books, easement filings, tax records and subdivision applications dating back nearly 30 years. Margaret worked with remarkable precision. She highlighted dates, cross-referenced signatures, compared legal descriptions line by line. Every so often she'd make a quiet note, or interesting. After nearly 3 hours, she stopped. Look at this. She pointed to 2 surveys. One was my family's official boundary survey completed 12 years earlier. The other had been submitted by Cedar Ridge during its development approval process. At first glance, they looked almost identical. Then I noticed it. One boundary line had shifted, barely, just enough to place nearly 12 acres of my eastern pasture inside the proposed development buffer. 12 acres, I said quietly. Margaret nodded. Convenient, isn't it? Could it be a mistake? She looked at me over her glasses. Ethan, I've spent 40 years reviewing land records. She tapped the altered survey. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. As if that weren't enough, Thomas returned carrying another folder. You asked for every amendment tied to Cedar Ridge. He handed it to Margaret. I found something odd. Inside was a letter addressed to the County Planning Commission. The signature belonged to my late father. Except, it wasn't his handwriting. I knew my father's signature as well as my own. This one copied the shape, not the rhythm. Margaret frowned immediately. Whoever signed this practiced. I felt anger building in my chest. The letter claimed my father had voluntarily agreed to future access rights across the eastern pasture, an agreement he had supposedly signed. 8 months after he died. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at the date. Finally, Margaret whispered, they forged a dead man's signature. Back at the farm that evening, I reviewed the trail camera footage again. This time, I wasn't watching Linda. I was watching everyone around her. One contractor repeatedly photographed my barn. Another measured the distance to an old underground utility shed my grandfather had built decades earlier. They weren't interested in fences. They weren't interested in appearance. They were looking for something specific. As the final clip played, one sentence drifted into the camera's microphone. A contractor lowered his voice, believing no one could hear. If Holloway's map is right, the other man nodded. It's underneath the Carter property. The recording ended. I froze the frame. Underneath? Underneath my property. Whatever they were searching for, it had nothing to do with HOA inspections. And for the first time, I realized my family's farm might be sitting on the very secret that someone had been willing to forge documents, trespass, and risk federal attention to uncover. I replayed the trail camera audio at least 20 times. If Holloway's map is right, it's underneath the Carter property. The sentence echoed through my workshop long after the video stopped. Underneath. Not beside. Not beyond the fence. Underneath. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the paused frame of the contractor. Years of investigations had taught me one simple truth. People rarely reveal their objective directly. They reveal it accidentally, usually when they think nobody important is listening. This felt like one of those moments. I called Margaret Whitmore. She answered on the second ring. Tell me you found something. I think I did. An hour later, she was sitting across from me at my kitchen table while the footage played on my laptop. She listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, she remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she asked, has anyone ever conducted a mineral survey on your land? I shook my head. No oil, no gas, no limestone quarry. What about old utility easements? Nothing besides the original electric line installed in the 70s. Margaret tapped the table thoughtfully. Then they're not chasing natural resources. What are they chasing? I don't know. She looked out the window toward the eastern pasture. But whatever it is, they're convinced your property is the key. The next morning I decided to stop guessing. Instead of searching the fields, I searched the paperwork. Every original document my father and grandfather had ever kept was stored inside a fire-resistant safe in the farmhouse basement. Most families would have thrown away old receipts and county correspondence decades earlier. My father never threw away anything. If someone ever questions your land, he'd always said, paper beats memory. By noon, boxes covered the basement floor, old tax records, insurance files, Hand-drawn boundary sketches, letters from neighboring farmers, receipts for fencing materials dating back to 1968. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, inside a weathered envelope labeled U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1984, I found a folded map. It wasn't a property survey. It was a topographical engineering map. Across the eastern section of my farm, someone had drawn a thick red circle by hand. Beside it were 4 words: Original Access Tunnel, sealed. I frowned. Access tunnel? I had lived on that farm most of my life. I'd never heard anyone mention a tunnel. Margaret adjusted her glasses. That's unusual. I unfolded another sheet tucked behind the map. It described a temporary underground service corridor, constructed during a flood control project in the early 1980s. The tunnel had been abandoned after the project ended and officially sealed. According to the report, the county retained engineering records, but there was something else. A handwritten note from my father. Do not remove this map. If anyone ever asks about the tunnel, call attorney Robert Gaines before saying anything. I stared at the note. I've never heard of Robert Gaines. Margaret slowly smiled. I have. You do? He was one of the best land use attorneys in Tennessee. What happened to him? He retired years ago. Is he still alive? I believe so. By late afternoon, Margaret had tracked down a phone number. Robert Gaines answered himself. His voice sounded old, but sharp. After introducing ourselves, Margaret explained why we were calling. There was a long silence. Finally, he sighed. I hoped that file would never become important. My pulse quickened. What file? The Carter file. You knew my father? Very well. He paused again. I think we should speak in person. Can you come to the farm? No. His tone became firm. Not there. Why not? Because if the people you're describing are looking for that tunnel, another pause, they may already be watching your property. He agreed to meet us the next morning at his office in downtown Franklin. I never made it. At 5:47 a.m., I woke to the sound of engines, not one, several. I looked through the bedroom window. 3 pickup trucks were parked along my eastern fence. A bulldozer sat on a low-buoy trailer behind them. Workers wearing reflective vests were unloading equipment. Linda Ashcroft stood in the middle of my pasture, wearing a bright white hard hat. I grabbed my boots and ran outside. What do you think you're doing? I shouted. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she smiled. We're beginning infrastructure work. On my land? According to our revised survey, she handed me a rolled set of plans. This section belongs to Cedar Ridge. I didn't even unroll them. It doesn't, she shrugged. Our contractor disagrees. I pointed toward the bulldozer. If that machine moves 1 inch onto my property, you're trespassing. Linda laughed. No, Mr. Carter. She looked around at the assembled workers. You've been trespassing on ours. Before I could answer, another vehicle pulled into the field. Then another, and another. County inspectors, sheriff's deputies, news vans. Someone had tipped off the local media. Television cameras immediately turned toward me. A reporter hurried across the grass. Mr. Carter, she called. The HOA claims you've illegally occupied 12 acres for decades. Do you have a response? Linda folded her arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle. This wasn't about construction anymore. It was public humiliation. She wanted the cameras to capture me angry, defensive, outnumbered. Instead, I reached into my truck and removed a long cardboard document tube. Inside were certified copies of every original survey, deed, and historical map Margaret and I had gathered, including the Army Corps engineering records and the forged letter bearing my late father's impossible signature. I handed the tube to Margaret, who had just stepped out of her car. She looked at me. You ready? I nodded. No more warnings. She smiled. Good. Because I filed the lawsuit an hour ago. Linda's confident expression faltered for the first time all week. Then Margaret added one final sentence, and the judge has already granted our request to preserve the property. Almost on cue, a sheriff's deputy walked toward the bulldozer operator and raised his hand. Shut it down. The engine went silent. Linda spun toward the deputy. You can't stop this project. He calmly handed her a packet of legal papers. You've been served. As she flipped through the pages, the color drained from her face. Then she reached the final exhibit. It was the enlarged copy of the forged letter, supposedly signed by my father, 8 months after his funeral. For the first time since this nightmare began, Linda wasn't angry. She looked terrified. And across the field, I saw another black SUV pulling onto my driveway. I recognized it immediately. It wasn't there for the lawsuit. It was there because the FBI had finally decided to step into the open. The Franklin County Courthouse had seen its share of heated property disputes over the years. This wasn't one of them. By the time our hearing began 3 weeks later, every seat in the gallery was filled. Local reporters lined the back wall with notebooks and cameras. Farmers from neighboring counties sat shoulder to shoulder with Cedar Ridge homeowners, all whispering about the same thing. How had a simple HOA disagreement turned into a federal investigation? I walked into the courtroom wearing a charcoal suit instead of my usual work clothes. Margaret Whitmore carried 2 banker's boxes, overflowing with exhibits. Behind us sat Supervisory Special Agent Rebecca Collins and Special Agent Daniel Ruiz. Neither wore uniforms. Neither said a word. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere. Across the aisle, Linda Ashcroft looked nothing like the confident woman who had marched onto my farm. She still wore an expensive navy suit, but the confidence was gone. She kept glancing toward Gregory Holloway, the Cedar Ridge developer, seated beside his legal team. He refused to look at her. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered precisely at 9 o'clock. "Be seated." Her voice was calm, but firm enough to silence the entire courtroom. "We are here regarding Carter versus Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, Cedar Ridge Development Group, and associated parties." She adjusted her glasses. "I understand there are also matters that may involve federal interests." Rebecca simply nodded. The judge looked at both legal teams. "I expect professionalism." No one argued. Gregory Holloway's attorney stood first. He spoke with polished confidence. "Your Honor, this case concerns nothing more than a boundary discrepancy caused by outdated surveys." He displayed a modern subdivision map. "Our clients relied upon engineering documents filed with the county in good faith." Margaret didn't object. She simply took notes. The attorney continued. "Mr. Carter has unfortunately misunderstood the extent of the development's legal easement." He smiled toward the jury box before catching himself. There wasn't one. This was a bench trial. Judge Brooks noticed. "So noted," she said dryly. A few quiet chuckles echoed through the gallery. The attorney's smile disappeared. Margaret rose slowly. "Your Honor." She placed one document on the evidence table. "I'd like to begin with ownership." For the next hour, she walked through my family's chain of title. Every deed, every transfer, every tax record, every licensed survey. The document stretched back more than 100 years. Not once did ownership of the disputed 12 acres change. Not once. Judge Brooks examined each certified copy carefully. Then Margaret introduced the next exhibit. The defendants rely heavily upon this survey. The altered boundary map appeared on the courtroom screen. "It shifts the eastern property line." She clicked a remote. The original survey appeared beside it. The difference looked tiny, barely noticeable, until Margaret overlaid the 2 images. The shifted line glowed bright red. Gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Brooks leaned forward. "When was this alteration made?" Margaret answered immediately. "Approximately 11 years after Mr. Carter's survey was officially recorded." "Were the Carters notified?" "No, Your Honor." "Were they asked to consent?" "No." The judge's expression hardened. Then came the forged letter. Margaret held up the original. "This document supposedly grants future access rights across Mr. Carter's property." She handed it to the clerk. "It also bears the signature of Harold Carter." Judge Brooks checked the date, then looked back at Margaret. "Counsel?" Margaret spoke quietly. "Mr. Carter's father passed away 8 months before this letter was signed." The courtroom became completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing. Gregory Holloway slowly lowered his head. Linda closed her eyes. Judge Brooks stared at the document for several long seconds. "Has this signature been examined?" "Yes." Margaret called our forensic document examiner. The expert explained every inconsistency. Pen pressure, stroke direction, ink age, letter formation. "It is my professional opinion," he concluded, "that this signature is a deliberate simulation." Judge Brooks looked toward the defense. "Would you like to cross-examine?" The defense attorney stood, then sat back down. No questions. The defense attempted to recover. They called Linda Ashcroft. She walked to the witness stand with stiff shoulders. After taking the oath, she answered Margaret's questions confidently at first. "You authorized inspections of Mr. Carter's property?" "Yes." "You entered without permission. We believed we had legal authority." "Based on what?" Our governing documents. Margaret handed her a copy. Please point to the paragraph granting authority over non-HOA land. Linda searched the pages. 1 minute passed, then another. She swallowed. I can't locate it because it isn't there. Margaret's voice remained calm. Isn't that correct? Linda hesitated. Yes. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Margaret continued. You also instructed contractors to place survey stakes inside Mr. Carter's pasture. We relied on the developer's survey, so you never verified ownership independently. No. You accused Mr. Carter of illegally occupying his own land. Linda looked down. Yes. And you requested access to every building on his farm. Yes. For what purpose? We were conducting an inspection. Margaret paused. An HOA inspection of a property outside your HOA. Linda had no answer. Then Rebecca Collins quietly stood. Your Honor. She approached the bench with a sealed evidence case. The United States requests permission to introduce limited evidence relevant to the defendant's intent. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Brooks unlocked the evidence case herself. Inside were copies of emails recovered under federal warrant. She read the first page silently, then the second. Her expression changed. She looked directly at Gregory Holloway. Mr. Holloway, her voice had become noticeably colder. Did you send an email instructing your staff to keep pressuring Carter until he gives up the eastern parcel? Holloway's attorney immediately stood. Objection. Judge Brooks ignored him. She lifted another document, and another referring to a sealed tunnel beneath the Carter property. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge struck her gavel. Order. Rebecca remained composed. There is additional evidence, Your Honor. Judge Brooks nodded. Proceed. Rebecca turned toward the courtroom display. We recovered surveillance footage recorded on Mr. Carter's farm. The screen came to life. The video showed Linda, the contractors, and then clearly captured the contractor's voice. If Holloway's map is right, it's underneath the Carter property. Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward Gregory Holloway. His face had gone completely pale. Rebecca reached for one final folder. The next exhibit explains exactly what they believed was underneath. Before she could open it, Holloway suddenly stood up so fast, his chair crashed backward onto the courtroom floor. I want a lawyer, he shouted. The courtroom exploded into chaos, and Judge Brooks immediately ordered everyone to remain exactly where they were, before announcing that the court would recess for 15 minutes. Just moments before delivering the most important ruling of the entire case. When court resumed 15 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. The confidence that Gregory Holloway and Linda Ashcroft had carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. Holloway sat rigidly beside his attorney, staring at the defense table without saying a word. Linda looked exhausted. The woman who had once marched across my pasture issuing orders now avoided eye contact with everyone, including her own board members. Judge Eleanor Brooks returned to the bench with a thick stack of notes. The courtroom rose. Be seated. Her voice carried the same calm authority as before, but there was a finality to it now. She looked directly at the defense. Before I announce my findings, I want to address something that deeply concerns this court. She held up the forged letter bearing my late father's signature. This document was submitted to public officials as though it were genuine. She paused. It was not. Her eyes swept across the courtroom. Someone forged the signature of a deceased landowner to create the appearance of legal consent. No one spoke. That conduct strikes at the integrity of our entire property recording system. The silence became almost unbearable. Judge Brooks continued. After reviewing the testimony, certified surveys, historical deeds, expert analysis and documentary evidence, this court finds that the Carter family has maintained uninterrupted ownership of the disputed 12 acres for more than 100 years. She turned toward me. Mr. Carter, your property rights are affirmed in full. A wave of relief washed over me, but I remained still. Margaret gently squeezed my arm. We're not finished, she whispered. She was right. Judge Brooks wasn't finished either. The court further finds that Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association possessed no legal authority whatsoever to inspect, regulate, or enter Mr. Carter's property. Linda slowly closed her eyes. The repeated entries onto Mr. Carter's land constitute trespass. She looked toward the clerk. A permanent injunction will issue immediately. The clerk nodded. Judge Brooks wasn't done. The altered survey submitted by the development company is declared invalid. She signed the order. Any county records relying upon that survey shall be corrected. Several county officials, seated in the gallery, immediately began writing notes. Then came the moment that changed everything. Judge Brooks folded her hands. Although this court is not deciding criminal liability today, The evidence presented raises substantial concerns regarding fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. She looked toward Rebecca Collins. Accordingly, certified copies of this record will be transmitted to the appropriate federal authorities. Rebecca simply replied, "Understood, Your Honor." Before anyone could stand, two individuals entered quietly through the rear courtroom doors. They weren't wearing uniforms, dark suits, professional expressions, FBI credentials. I recognized both of them from Nashville. Rebecca glanced back only once, before returning her attention to the bench. This wasn't planned for dramatic effect. It was procedure. Judge Brooks noticed their arrival, but continued speaking. The civil portion of this matter is concluded. She struck the gavel once. Immediately afterward, Rebecca stood. Gregory Holloway. His attorney looked confused. Rebecca spoke calmly. "Please remain seated." Holloway didn't move. Special Agent Daniel Ruiz stepped forward and presented a warrant. "Gregory Allen Holloway, pursuant to a federal arrest warrant, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and related federal offenses." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Television cameras began recording furiously. Holloway looked at his attorney. "You said they didn't have enough." His attorney quietly replied, "I didn't know about the emails." Ruiz secured Holloway without unnecessary force. There was no shouting, no dramatic struggle, just the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Linda Ashcroft watched in disbelief. "No," she shook her head repeatedly. "No, this isn't happening." Rebecca approached her. "Miss Ashcroft." Linda looked up hopefully. "I didn't write those emails. I know." Relief briefly crossed Linda's face. Then Rebecca continued, "But you knowingly relied on forged documents, authorized repeated trespasses, and made false statements during the investigation." Linda's shoulders slumped. Rebecca handed her a formal notice. "You are not under arrest today." Linda exhaled sharply. "But you are the subject of an active federal investigation." The relief vanished instantly. I only did what Gregory told me." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "You'll have an opportunity to explain that." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded everyone involved. Microphones stretched toward me from every direction. "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement? Did you know this would become a federal case? Are you satisfied with today's ruling?" I looked at Margaret. She gave a small nod. I stepped toward the microphones. "My family worked this land for 4 generations." I paused. This case was never about winning against an HOA. It was about protecting the truth. I looked across the courthouse lawn. If people with money or influence can simply redraw property lines, forge signatures, and intimidate ordinary landowners, I shook my head. Then nobody's property is truly safe. The reporters lowered their microphones. For a moment, no one asked another question. The weeks that followed brought consequences far beyond our farm. Cedar Ridge Estates suspended its entire HOA board. Several board members resigned after admitting they had approved inspections without ever reading the governing documents. The development company's financing collapsed as lenders withdrew support. County officials ordered independent reviews of every survey connected to Gregory Holloway's projects. Investigators uncovered similar irregularities involving other landowners. Some had settled quietly years earlier, believing they had no choice. Now they came forward. Civil lawsuits multiplied. Federal subpoenas followed. As for Linda Ashcroft, she eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators. Her testimony helped expose how Holloway's company had pressured HOA boards into acting as unofficial enforcement arms to intimidate neighboring property owners into selling land below market value. A month after the verdict, I walked the eastern pasture at sunrise. The temporary fencing was gone. The illegal survey stakes were gone. The bulldozers were gone. Only the sound of cattle grazing and birds settling into the old oak trees remained. I stopped beside the weathered fence where my father had once rested his hand on my shoulder. The same words echoed in my mind. People think owning land means the land belongs to you. It doesn't. You belong to it. For the first time in months, I smiled. Because justice hadn't just protected my family's farm. It had protected every honest landowner who refused to be bullied into surrendering what was rightfully theirs. 6 months have passed since the courtroom doors closed behind us, and life on the farm has finally returned to the way it should be. Every morning starts with the same familiar routine: feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. The only difference now is that I appreciate every quiet moment a little more than I used to. The old red barn still stands exactly where my grandfather built it. The eastern pasture remains untouched, and every time I walk that field, I'm reminded that the greatest victories aren't measured in money. They're measured in what you're willing to protect. This experience taught me something I'll never forget. Never assume that confidence means someone is right, and never let intimidation convince you to surrender the truth. Whether you're defending your home, your family, or your reputation, facts, patience, and integrity are stronger than fear. If you've ever dealt with an overreaching HOA, a property dispute, or someone who thought they could bully you because they believed you wouldn't fight back, I'd genuinely love to hear your story. Have you ever stood up to someone who thought they were above the law? Share your experience in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic HOA, property rights, or legal justice story. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of the people you love, stand up for what's right, and remember, some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the other side may seem.